It was one of those perfect fall days when the sun was warm but the breeze still carried the crispness of winter. I had been planning the hike for weeks. Something about being out in nature, the solitude, and the sense of challenge that hiking brought always gave me a feeling of peace. But this time was different. I didn't know it yet, but this hike would be one I'd never forget. I chose a trail that was known for being a bit off the beaten path, with fewer people and less noise. A real escape. The guidebook described it as a moderately challenging hike, with a mix of rocky terrain and a forest trail. It was supposed to be about a 6-hour round trip. Nothing too crazy, but enough to feel like I'd earned the sense of accomplishment at the end. The morning had started well. I woke up early, packed my bag with essentials: water, snacks, a map, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and headed out. I drove for about an hour before reaching the trailhead. There was a small parking lot, barely enough space for 5 cars. Only 2 were parked when I arrived, and I didn't see anyone around. I remember thinking it was a little odd, but I didn't mind. I preferred the quiet. I grabbed my pack and started down the trail. The first part of the hike was easy, a gentle incline through the forest. The trees were vibrant, their leaves turning shades of orange and red. Birds chirped overhead, and I felt the air around me shift between the warmth of the sun and the coolness of the shaded trail. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the fresh air and the feeling of being completely alone in nature. About an hour in, I reached a section where the trail split. One path went up toward a ridge, and the other continued into a thick grove of trees. According to the map, the ridge was the more scenic route, offering views of the valley below. I didn't hesitate, I took the ridge. The climb was steeper than I had expected. I wasn't in bad shape, but the rocky terrain and the loose gravel made it a challenge. My boots slipped a couple of times, and I had to pause and catch my breath. As I looked around, the trees began to thin, and I could see the valley stretching out below. The view was incredible. I took a deep breath, appreciating the beauty around me, and snapped a couple of pictures. After a few moments, I continued up. The trail flattened out for a bit, and I was able to pick up my pace again. But the air felt different now, cooler somehow. I looked around, trying to place what had changed. The birds were silent, and there was an odd stillness in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unusual. I brushed it off and kept moving. By midday, I reached the summit. The view was just as spectacular as I had imagined. I sat down for a break, drinking some water and having a snack. I could see the entire valley below, the town in the distance, and the mountain range on the far side. The wind picked up a little, but it felt refreshing. For a moment, everything felt perfect. But then, a strange feeling washed over me. It was like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if someone was watching me. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. I wasn't expecting anyone, but the feeling persisted. It wasn't like I heard anything, but something about the silence felt wrong. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I packed up and started heading back down the way I came. But as I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been fairly easy to follow on the way up, seemed different now. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it didn't look the same. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. It was as if the forest had closed in around me. I checked my map. I was still on the right path, but the feeling of unease grew stronger with each step. The trail was narrower now, and I found myself having to duck under low-hanging branches. The breeze had died down, and everything felt unnervingly still. I pressed on, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I walked, the feeling didn't go away. It only got worse. By the time I reached the fork in the trail again, I felt a sense of panic rising. The path I had taken up was no longer visible. In fact, the trees and rocks seemed to have shifted. The trail that I thought was a clear path was now obscured by dense underbrush. I stopped, breathing heavily. I checked my map again. The route should have been straightforward. But now, nothing looked familiar. Panic set in. I could feel my heart racing, my thoughts spiraling. I had no idea which direction to go. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and I knew I had to make a decision fast. I couldn't stay here in the dark. I decided to head down the path toward the grove of trees. The map suggested it was the same route, but there was no guarantee anymore. As I walked, the trees closed in around me, casting long shadows. I could hear my breath echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, and I noticed something else. There were no sounds.
No birds.
No wind. Just complete, oppressive quiet. The kind of silence that made every footstep seem louder than it was. Minutes stretched into hours. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but it felt like forever. My legs ached and I was thirsty. My stomach growled. I couldn't stop now. The light was fading fast, and I knew that if I didn't find my way soon, I'd be stuck out here in the dark. Then I saw it, an old wooden sign. It was barely visible through the trees, but I recognized the shape. It was the sign for the trailhead. I stumbled toward it, relief flooding over me. But as I got closer, my heart sank. The sign was twisted. The lettering was scratched, as if something had tried to rip it off. And the path that should have led to the parking lot was completely blocked by fallen trees and debris. Couldn't believe it. My stomach dropped. How could this be? The sun had set completely now, and the only light came from my flashlight. I switched it on, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was lost, completely lost. I retraced my steps, trying to remember which way I had gone, but everything felt wrong now. I couldn't find any landmarks that made sense. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, with no way out. As I walked, the panic in my chest grew worse. I started to hear things, branches snapping, leaves rustling behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks or if someone or something was really out there. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it, a faint light in the distance. I wasn't sure if it was real, but I had to go toward it. I forced my legs to move, stumbling over rocks and branches. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and soon I could make out the silhouette of a person standing by a tree. I called out, but no sound came out. I tried again, louder this time, but the figure didn't move. I rushed forward, my heart pounding, until I was right in front of them. But when I looked, there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, disoriented, and that's when I heard it. My own voice, echoing back to me from the darkness. I froze. It wasn't possible. The voice was mine, but it didn't sound right. It was distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I turned in every direction, but I couldn't see anything. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The forest was silent again. I stood there, frozen, until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see the faint outline of a trail, a narrow path that led out of the woods. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Minutes later, I emerged from the trees into the parking lot. My car was still there, the engine cold. I climbed in, shaking, and drove away without looking back. It took me a long time to shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, whenever I think back to that hike, I can't shake the sense that something or someone was following me. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks, but I do know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to those woods again. I had always loved hiking. It was my way of escaping the noise of everyday life, the stress of work, and the constant buzz of the city. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the feeling of being surrounded by nature, that brought me peace. This particular hike was something I had been planning for months. A solo adventure through a relatively unknown trail in the mountains. It was supposed to be a few days of solitude, just me and the wilderness. The trail was remote, far off the beaten path, and that's part of what attracted me to it. Most people wouldn't bother with it because it wasn't easy to get to, but I wanted that challenge. I had checked the weather forecast a few times before heading out, and everything looked fine. No rain, mild temperatures. Perfect conditions for a hike. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had all the essentials. A map, water, food, my first aid kit, a flashlight, and my trusty hiking boots. I wasn't expecting any real danger, but I knew it was always best to be prepared. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise and casting a golden glow over the forest. There were no other cars in the parking lot, no signs of other hikers. It was just me and the mountain ahead. The beginning of the trail was easy enough, a well-trodden path through tall trees with the sounds of birds in the distance. The air was crisp, and everything felt calm and serene. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the trail grew narrower, more rugged. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches intertwining above me, blocking out much of the sunlight. The forest floor was covered in thick moss, and I had to step carefully to avoid slipping. I felt the familiar thrill of being far from civilization, a small part of me feeling a little bit like an explorer. The first day went by without incident. I made camp at a small clearing, set up my tent, and cooked myself a simple meal. The stars came out that night, brighter than I had ever seen them. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of an owl. I lay in my tent, listening to the night, feeling at peace. But as the darkness settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was just my imagination. The forest was alive, after all, and I was just a visitor in its domain. The next morning, I woke up early, packed up camp, and continued on the trail. The path was even less defined now, with thick underbrush and rocks scattered along the way. It was clear that few people ventured this far into the mountains. I passed a few small streams, their clear water rushing over smooth stones, and paused for a moment to refill my water bottle. The air felt different here, colder, heavier. It was as though I had crossed some invisible line, and the wilderness was growing more untamed with each step. I didn't think much of it at first. The solitude was something I had come to crave. But as the day wore on, I started to notice things that unsettled me. Small things at first. A branch cracked in the distance, though there was no wind. I brushed it off as a deer or some other animal. But then, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud beside the trail. They were fresh, as if someone had passed through only moments before. I stopped and stared at them, trying to gauge their size. They looked human, boot prints, deep and clear in the soft earth. It was odd. I hadn't seen another hiker all day. I was in a remote part of the trail, far from any popular spots, and I hadn't heard anyone approach. I stood there for a long moment, the feeling of being watched creeping back into my mind. I checked the map, but there were no signs of other trails nearby. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, I told myself to keep moving. Maybe I was just paranoid. After all, the wilderness was full of surprises. I continued on, my pace picking up slightly, my mind racing. The forest around me seemed to grow quieter, the air thicker, as if it was holding its breath. The trail twisted and turned, leading me up a steep incline. My legs were starting to ache, but I pressed on, determined to reach the next clearing and set up camp for the night. I glanced at the map again. According to it, there was a campsite nearby, a small area by a creek where I could rest. I pushed forward, hoping to make it there before dark. But then, something stopped me. A sound, a rustle in the bushes to my left. It was too loud to be a deer or any small animal. I froze, straining my ears, my heart beginning to race. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone was out there. I was sure of it. I stepped off the trail, trying to stay hidden, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't see anything, but the noises were getting closer. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps moving in my direction. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I waited, holding my breath, until the sound passed just a few feet away from where I was crouching. I didn't move a muscle. I was too scared to even breathe. When the footsteps finally faded into the distance, I waited a little longer, just to be sure. My mind was racing. What the hell was going on? I wasn't expecting anyone to be out here, especially not this deep in the wilderness. I debated my options. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there? No, that felt like a bad idea. I didn't know who they were, or if they were even human. I decided to wait it out. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the sky was turning a deep shade of orange. It would be dark soon, and I needed to get moving if I wanted to find the campsite before nightfall. Slowly, cautiously, I resumed my hike, making as little noise as possible. The next hour felt like a blur. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every crackle of a twig, every rustle of leaves. My body was on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following me. I moved faster, but the path grew steeper and more difficult. My legs burned, and the weight of my pack felt unbearable. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being watched, but there was never anyone there. The forest felt too still, too quiet. It was as if the world had gone silent, leaving only me and the oppressive sense of dread hanging in the air. Eventually, I reached the clearing where the map had indicated the campsite should be. But when I arrived, there was nothing. No sign of a campsite, no fire pit, no tent. Just an empty patch of grass and a few scattered rocks. My heart sank. I checked the map again, certain I was in the right place, but the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had missed it. Somehow I had walked right past it. I turned to retrace my steps, but the sun had set, and darkness had fully enveloped the forest. I was lost. Worse, I wasn't sure if I was alone. I had always been someone who found peace in nature, in the simplicity of the outdoors. The rustling of leaves, the sound of birds, the smell of pine, all of it gave me a sense of freedom that I couldn't find anywhere else. So, when I decided to take on a solo hike through a remote mountain trail, I didn't think twice. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to clear my head and get away from everything. The trail was well known, though not heavily trafficked. I had studied the route on a map before, checking the distances and reading up on others' experiences. People said it was challenging but nothing too extreme, which was just what I was looking for. I wasn't an expert, but I knew enough about hiking to be cautious. I had packed everything I needed: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a fully charged phone. The weather was clear, and everything felt right as I drove to the trailhead. As I started up the path, I felt a sense of excitement. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, with the occasional break where I could catch a glimpse of the towering peaks in the distance. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of damp earth. I was in my element. I made good progress, stopping only briefly for water and to take in the views. A few hours in, the trail began to get steeper. I was still enjoying myself, though I could feel the strain in my legs. The higher I climbed, the more isolated I became. There was nobody else around. The sounds of the world outside the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt and rocks. The solitude felt comforting, but something in the back of my mind told me I should be cautious. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of unease, like a gut feeling you can't quite explain. I shook it off. I'd been on remote trails before, and nothing had ever gone wrong. I knew how to handle myself. The day wore on. By late afternoon, I was about 2/3 of the way up the mountain. I had passed a few small streams and had crossed over a few log bridges, each one creaking under my weight. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I knew I should probably turn back soon, but I felt determined to keep going. I had come this far and the summit was so close. I decided to press on for just a little longer. I pushed through the growing fatigue, telling myself it would be worth it. The trail was becoming more rugged. There were sections that required careful foot placement, but nothing that felt dangerous. That's when I saw it. A narrow path veering off to the right, partially obscured by thick brush. It wasn't marked on the map, but it looked like it might lead to a scenic overlook. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take the detour. As I moved off the main trail and into the overgrown path, I noticed how quickly the environment changed. The trees grew thicker here, and the air felt denser, more still. There was no sound, not even the usual chirping of birds. It felt almost unnaturally quiet. I paused for a moment, my ears straining for any noise, but there was nothing, not even the breeze. I continued down the path, brushing past ferns and branches, until I reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of dry grass surrounded by trees, but it had a certain feel to it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes you feel like something is watching you, even though you know it's all in your head. I stood there for a while, trying to shake off the strange sensation. I reminded myself that I was alone in the wilderness, and my mind was just playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath and turned around to head back to the main trail. That's when I heard it, a soft crunching sound, as if someone was walking through the underbrush just beyond the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been alone for hours. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I looked around, but there was no one in sight, just the dense forest, stretching in every direction. I stood still, straining my ears, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, I thought, but something about it didn't feel right. I had a gut feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the silence stretched on, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I decided to leave the clearing and get back to the main trail. I quickened my pace, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. My footsteps echoed in the quiet woods, the sound too loud in the emptiness. When I finally reached the main trail again, the sun had sunk low enough that the shadows had lengthened, and the air was beginning to cool. I checked my phone for the time, almost 6 in the evening. It would be dark soon, and I wasn't about to stay out here after dark, especially with the unsettling feeling still lingering. I started making my way back down the mountain, but as I descended, I realized something was off. The trail, which had been clear and easy to follow on my way up, seemed to have changed. The familiar landmarks I had passed earlier were no longer in sight. I turned around, checking to make sure I hadn't missed the turn, but the trail behind me was unfamiliar too. I was sure I hadn't wandered off course, but the surroundings felt different. I stopped to take a breath and calm my nerves. The weight of the situation started to dawn on me. The trail I had been following should have led back to the parking lot, but I was no longer certain of my direction. It was as if the mountain had shifted somehow, as though it was hiding the way out from me. I checked my phone again, but the signal had dropped. No bars, no GPS, nothing. My stomach twisted with a sense of dread. I wasn't lost, but something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had somehow strayed from the path, even though I had been following it carefully. The light was quickly fading. I knew I needed to make a decision. I could either keep trying to find my way down, or I could stay put and wait for daylight. But the idea of staying out here, in this unsettling place, made my skin crawl. I pushed forward, trying to stay calm. The trail grew steeper, and I was forced to pay close attention to where I placed my feet. The trees around me closed in, their branches heavy with shadows. The path seemed to narrow, and the air felt colder. It was like the mountain itself was closing in on me, trapping me. I stopped again, listening. This time, I was sure I heard something behind me, a rustle in the brush. I turned quickly, but again, there was nothing. My pulse raced. I had to be imagining things. But the feeling of being pursued wouldn't leave. It was as if someone or something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving. The minutes stretched on like hours, and the last bit of daylight disappeared, leaving me in the growing darkness. The sound of my breathing was the only thing I could hear, heavy and ragged in the still night air. Then I saw it, a light in the distance, a faint glow like a lantern or a campfire. I could barely make it out, but it was enough to give me hope. Maybe someone else was out here. Maybe they could help me find my way. With renewed energy, I made my way toward the light, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I realized the light was not moving. It didn't flicker like a fire, but instead, it stayed steady, almost like an artificial light. I approached cautiously, hoping to find another hiker or a campsite, but as I got closer, the light began to dim. It flickered out entirely, leaving me in darkness once again. I froze, my heart stopping. The air felt thick now, almost suffocating. The path ahead of me was unclear, but I could still feel it, that sense of being followed. I didn't know what to do. Then, in the distance, I saw it again. The faint glow, but this time it was moving, slowly swaying in the darkness. My mind raced. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if something was actually out there. I took a step forward, but something inside me screamed to stop. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light disappeared. I don't know how long I stood there, too terrified to move, but I finally made a decision. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the trail, not caring about the darkness or the uneven ground. The only thing that mattered was getting away. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a clearing, and there it was, the familiar trailhead. My car, the parking lot. I had made it back. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out and the signal was back. I quickly dialed the number for the park ranger station, my voice shaky as I explained what had happened. They told me I wasn't the first to report strange occurrences on that trail. Others had felt the same way, like they were being watched, like the mountain itself was playing tricks. But there were no real explanations, no logical reason for it. I drove home that night, my hands clenched on the steering wheel. I've hiked many trails since, but I've never forgotten that hike. There are some places in the wilderness that seem to have a life of their own. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that day, but one thing's for sure, I'll never take my safety for granted again. The hike started like any other I'd done before. I've always been a fan of the outdoors. Nothing beats the feeling of fresh air in your lungs, the sound of leaves crunching under your boots, and the quiet solitude of nature. This time, though, I was hiking alone. I had made the decision to take a weekend for myself, a chance to escape the daily grind and get some much-needed space from the world. I wasn't worried about being alone. I'd done solo hikes plenty of times. The mountain I was heading to was one of my favorites, a rugged, almost untouched place. It wasn't the easiest, but it wasn't the hardest either. It had a bit of everything: rocky paths, dense woods, streams to cross, and a fantastic view at the summit. I left early in the morning to make the most of the daylight. The sky was clear, the sun just starting to climb above the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My backpack was light, just the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a headlamp, just in case. I had planned to make it to the top by afternoon and set up camp near the summit. There were some secluded spots I knew about, perfect for a quiet night under the stars. The trail started off well enough, a well-worn path that zigzagged its way through the trees. The air was cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel like you're the only person alive in the world. I took deep breaths, letting the scent of pine and earth fill my lungs. It felt good to be away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant demands of daily life. As I climbed higher, the path began to narrow. The trees thickened, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves became the only company. I passed a few markers on the trail, making sure to note the distances and timing. I didn't want to risk getting lost, though I was pretty familiar with the area. Still, it's always best to stay cautious, especially when hiking alone. About 2 hours in, I reached a part of the trail I wasn't as familiar with. The path started to split, one going left, and the other heading up the mountain a bit more steeply. I remembered this area vaguely, but I wasn't sure which trail was the one I had taken before. The left path seemed a little more worn, so I decided to take it, figuring it would eventually loop around to the main route. It didn't take long for the forest around me to change. The dense trees started to thin out, and the ground underfoot grew uneven and rocky. There was something different about this part of the hike, something unsettling. It wasn't the terrain or the quiet, but the way the forest felt. The trees felt too close, almost as if they were crowding in on me. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. Normally, you'd hear the wind or the distant call of wildlife, but here there was nothing, just the sound of my own breath and the crunch of my boots on the ground. I kept moving, telling myself it was just my imagination. I checked my map again. According to it, the path should lead me back to the main trail, but as I walked, the trail seemed to get smaller, less defined. The rocks beneath my feet grew sharper, and the brush on either side of me thickened. I could still see the distant peak of the mountain, but it was farther away than it should have been. The sun was still up, but I felt like I had been walking for much longer than I had. The feeling that something was off grew stronger. I stopped to rest for a moment, leaning against a large boulder. That's when I noticed it. There was no sound at all. No barges, no insects, no wind. Just the rustling of my own movements. It was eerie, but I shook it off. After all, nature could be quiet sometimes. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing unease gnawing at me. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, then decided to press on. Maybe it was just fatigue setting in. My eyes kept scanning the path, but it was getting harder to focus. The trail wasn't getting any clearer, and I wasn't sure if I was heading in the right direction anymore. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. I'd been expecting that, but it still felt frustrating. The path started to curve again, leading me deeper into the forest. I thought I saw a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I waited, but the movement didn't repeat itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Maybe it was an animal, but it had felt different, too fast, too deliberate. I shook off the feeling and kept walking, but now every step felt heavier. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The trees stretched out in all directions, blocking the light, making the forest seem even darker than it was. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the path ahead, but my mind kept wandering to that strange feeling, that odd sensation of being watched. At some point, I realized I was lost. The trail had completely disappeared, and I was now walking through thick brush, unable to see anything familiar. The rocks had become jagged cliffs, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if I were walking on a ledge. Panic started to creep in. I knew this mountain well enough to know I shouldn't have veered off like this. I should have turned back sooner, but now it was too late for that. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stop. I had to think. I pulled out my map, trying to get my bearings. But the more I looked at it, the more confused I became. The landmarks didn't match up. The forest around me looked different from the ones I had hiked through before. My thoughts were racing, my hands shaking. I couldn't remember how far I'd walked or which direction I'd gone. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the panic was growing. The forest felt suffocating. There was no escape from the feeling of being lost, of being completely alone in a place that didn't make sense anymore. I sat down on a rock to think, trying to breathe and calm my racing heart. The air around me felt colder now, and the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. I was losing daylight, and with it, any hope of making it back to the trailhead before dark. I needed to find shelter for the night. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, not caring anymore if I looked ridiculous. I grabbed my headlamp from my backpack, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. I needed to think. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how truly isolated I was. The woods felt endless, and the mountain felt like a giant that had swallowed me whole. There was no clear way out. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise in the distance. It wasn't just the wind, it was something moving. My heart stopped in my chest. My eyes darted around the trees, but all I could see was darkness creeping in. The noise grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of it. It was too deliberate, too consistent. Something was out there. I grabbed my pack and stood up, my legs feeling weak. I started walking again, my eyes scanning the shadows, my pulse racing. The noise was still there, just beyond the trees. Every time I turned my head, it seemed to move just out of sight, like whatever it was knew exactly where I was. Minutes felt like hours, and I kept walking, trying to stay calm. The feeling of being pursued started to overwhelm me. My mind was racing with every possible scenario, every possible thing that could be out there in the dark. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the fear creeping into my chest. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Ahead of me, a large rock formation rose from the ground, the jagged edges almost like a natural wall. I quickly scrambled up the rocks, finding a narrow gap where I could wedge myself in. It wasn't comfortable, but it would keep me hidden. I huddled there, trying to make myself as small as possible, my breath shallow and fast. The sound of movement was closer now. It wasn't just in my head anymore. There was something out there, circling me. Couldn't see it, but I could feel it. My headlamp was still in my hand, but I didn't dare turn it on. I had to stay hidden. I stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours. The forest had gone deathly silent again, but I knew better than to trust the quiet. Whatever it was waiting for me to make a mistake. But I couldn't stay here forever. The night was falling fast, and I had to figure out a way to get out. I knew if I stayed in this spot too long, I'd only make myself an easier target. I needed to move, but moving meant risking making noise. At long last, the noise seemed to fade. I waited for a few more minutes, listening carefully. When I was sure it was safe, I carefully climbed down from the rocks and started moving again. The trail was still nowhere to be found, but I could make out faint shadows in the distance. I figured I could try heading toward the left, where I thought the main trail might be. With each step, the fear eased just a little bit. The further I went, the more the forest opened up, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the familiar markers of the main trail. I wasn't entirely sure how I had gotten there, but I didn't care. I was back on track. The sun had set by the time I made it to the summit. It wasn't the perfect hike I had planned, but I had made it. I set up camp under the stars, grateful to be safe. As I lay there in my tent, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, I realized that sometimes even the most familiar places can become unrecognizable. And that's when you learn to trust your instincts. I had always been a fan of hiking. There was something about the solitude, the sound of my boots crunching over the dirt paths, and the peace of being surrounded by trees. It was my way of escaping the noise of everyday life, a way to clear my head. But there was one hike, one that I took a few weeks ago, that I'll never forget, and not in the peaceful, serene way I had hoped for. This one changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, an easy loop through a small trail near the edge of a quiet mountain town. I had been there once before a few years ago, but this time I was going alone. I wasn't worried. After all, it was a popular trail, well-marked and relatively short. I grabbed my backpack, packed a water bottle, snacks, and a first aid kit, and set off early in the morning. The weather was clear, the air crisp, and I felt energized as I hit the trailhead. First, everything went smoothly. The path wound through thick forests, with towering trees that seemed to stretch for miles. Birds called from the branches above, and the sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light onto the forest floor. The trail was familiar, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to blend with the natural rhythm of the woods. I was lost in the beauty of it all. The first hour was effortless. The trail was wide, easy to follow, and there was nothing unusual about it. As I moved deeper into the forest, the silence felt almost sacred, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an animal. I could feel the weight of the world slipping away with every step. Then, things started to change. It wasn't immediate, but little by little, I noticed something off. The trail began to narrow, and the trees grew denser, their branches tangling above me. I thought nothing of it at first. Trails sometimes shift as they wind through the woods. But as the minutes passed, the path began to feel less like a trail and more like something that had been forgotten. The ground underfoot was uneven, the dirt more like loose gravel, and the trees were packed so tightly together that the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. I slowed my pace and looked around, but there was no sign of another hiker. I wasn't worried yet. It wasn't unusual to have a trail to yourself, especially in the early morning. But something about this place felt wrong. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by the woods. The sound of birds faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I checked my watch. I had been walking for almost 2 hours, but the trail didn't seem to match up with the map I had. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, not even a hint of a bar. The sense of isolation began to settle in, but I shrugged it off. The trail must have just twisted more than I remembered. It wasn't anything to worry about. But then I found something strange. Up ahead, I saw a wooden sign nailed to a tree. It wasn't on the map, and there was no trail marker attached to it. I walked closer, curious, and saw that the sign had been scratched over several times, with jagged lines cutting through the wood. I could barely make out the word caution, but the rest of it was too worn down to read clearly. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn back. But no, it was just a warning sign. Every trail has them. I kept walking, but something had shifted. The air felt thick now, heavier than before. I tried to ignore it, pushing on. The trail was now barely visible underfoot, the dirt replaced with rocks and roots that made it difficult to keep my footing. I had to focus, stepping carefully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see anyone, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't just imagining things. I felt like something was following me, watching me. I turned around several times, but there was nothing there. Just trees, rocks and shadows stretching long across the path. I kept going, though. After all, there was no turning back now. It was already late in the afternoon, and the sun would be setting soon. I needed to get out of the woods before it got dark. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck here overnight. But then I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks. A small clearing. It wasn't large, but it was open enough for me to take a breather. The trees parted slightly, and I could see the sky beyond. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small stone structure. It was crumbling, overgrown with ivy, but it didn't belong. It wasn't on the map, and it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. The closer I got, the more the hairs on my neck prickled. There was no reason for a stone structure to be in the middle of a hiking trail, especially one so hidden away in the woods. It was old, its stones worn and weathered, but it looked out of place in this part of the forest. I stepped inside the ruins, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air here was thick, stifling almost, and it smelled damp, like mildew and moss. I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping over me and instead focused on the structure itself. It was small, only about 10 feet across, and its walls were half collapsed, with vines crawling up the sides. The stone floors were cracked, but they still held their shape. And that's when I saw it. Tucked in the corner of the structure was something that looked like a small pile of twigs and leaves. I knelt down, drawn to it despite myself, and pushed the pile aside. Beneath it, I found a small, rusted tin box. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, and I could feel the weight of it like it was something important, something that shouldn't be here. I pried open the box, and inside was a collection of old, brittle papers, some torn and faded. My curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded one of the sheets. It was a hand-drawn map, crisscrossed with lines and scribbles that made no sense. The ink was faded, the paper fragile, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I studied it for a moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The map seemed to show the trail I was on, but it was incomplete, and the route was all wrong. Suddenly, I heard something, a rustling noise, faint at first, but then louder. I snapped the box shut and shoved it into my bag, my heart racing. I wasn't alone anymore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the hairs on my arms prickled. I could feel someone or something watching me again, and this time, I wasn't imagining it. I bolted out of the clearing, my legs pumping as I ran down the trail. Couldn't look back, couldn't stop. The thought of that box, the map, and whatever was behind me was too much. I had to get out of there. My breathing grew heavy, and my legs burned with exhaustion, but I didn't slow down. The light was fading fast, and the forest seemed to grow darker with every step I took. I was lost. There was no sign of the trail now, only twisted trees and thick underbrush. But then, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw it. A flicker of light ahead, cutting through the trees. It was faint, almost like a distant lantern, but it was enough. I pushed myself harder, stumbling over rocks and roots, barely keeping my balance as I made my way toward the light. The path opened up, and I emerged from the forest into a small clearing. There, standing at the edge, was a cabin. It was old, but it looked lived in. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a faint light shone from the windows. It looked like a place of safety, like a way out of the nightmare I had just experienced. I ran toward the cabin, my body trembling with relief. As I reached the door, I knocked, but there was no answer. No one came. I tried the door, it was unlocked. Inside, it was simple. A fireplace, an old wooden table, and a few chairs. Nothing to suggest it had been abandoned. I walked through the small cabin, my eyes darting around. But as I reached the window, I froze. There, in the distance, I saw something moving, something walking along the edge of the forest. It was a figure too far to make out clearly, but it was unmistakably there. And as I stared, I could have sworn it was looking straight at me. I locked the door, sat down by the fire, and waited. I didn't dare leave, not just yet. But the light from the cabin made me feel safer than I had in hours. I didn't know who or what that figure was, but I knew one thing. I was getting out of there in the morning, and I wasn't going to be hiking any trails anytime soon. The morning came, and the sun was rising over the horizon. I left the cabin without a word, and when I stepped back onto the trail, everything seemed normal again. The path was clear, and the woods were peaceful. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had walked those woods. But at least for now, I was safe. I'd been hiking for hours by the time I noticed how quiet the forest had become. It wasn't the usual silence you get when you're deep in nature, the kind of peacefulness that comes with distance from civilization. No, this felt different. The wind had stopped, and the usual rustle of leaves and birdsong had gone completely still. Even the sound of my boots crunching against the trail seemed unnaturally loud now. It had started as a normal hike, a solo trip to escape the noise of the city. I'd done plenty of hiking in my life, nothing extreme, just the usual trails that looped through the woods around my hometown. This one, though, was different. It was one of those trails that didn't show up on the maps, one that I'd stumbled upon a few months ago while exploring the outskirts of the park. It was wild and untamed, winding through the dense forest. I'd never seen anyone else on it, but that had always intrigued me. I'd even heard rumors from locals about this particular spot, how it was a bit too remote, a bit too eerie. But I didn't believe in stories or local legends. I was just a hiker, not someone who believed in superstitions. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I figured it was time to head back. I had enough water, but I hadn't planned on spending the night out here. The trail had started to get a little harder to follow, but I didn't think much of it at first. I trusted my instincts and my experience. The markers had become less frequent, and the trees had grown thicker, blocking out more light. I kept walking, occasionally glancing back to make sure I hadn't lost my way. But after a while, I realized that I hadn't seen any of the usual trail markers for what felt like an hour. The path had begun to narrow, and the trees seemed to crowd in closer. A feeling of unease settled over me, though I pushed it aside. I wasn't lost, I told myself. It was just that the trail was harder to follow than I thought. The deeper I went, the more unsettling things became. The air seemed cooler now, and not in the refreshing way you get after a hike. It was a coldness that made me feel like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a rustling in the underbrush, but when I looked, there was nothing there. My heart began to race. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the sound of my feet moving through the fallen leaves. But the quiet was still there, unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence that makes you question if something's off. I should have turned around, but I didn't. My mind kept telling me to keep going, that it was just my imagination, that I'd find the trail again soon. It wasn't until I saw the strange markings on the trees that I felt a cold rush of fear. They were carved into the bark, just small notches, but the way they were spaced out seemed intentional. Some of the markings were old, faded by time, while others were fresh, as if they had been made recently. I stopped and stared at them, my fingers trembling as I traced one of the notches with my eyes. There was something unsettling about them, something that made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be here. That's when the thoughts started racing in my head. What if this trail wasn't just forgotten, it was abandoned for a reason? What if people came out here and something happened to them? Maybe something had happened to the people who had carved those marks. Maybe they were trying to leave a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into the woods, like something out there was pulling me in. The sun was nearly gone now, and I could barely make out the path ahead of me. The trees had grown so dense that the light from the setting sun barely filtered through anymore. The darkness was creeping in fast. I knew I had to make a decision, turn back or keep going. I chose to keep going. Mistake. I don't know how much time passed after that. I tried to keep my bearings, but the trail was impossible to follow now. It felt like the forest had swallowed me whole. Every direction looked the same, and the trees seemed to close in on me, trapping me. I should have turned around, but my pride kept me going. I wasn't lost, I told myself. I had to find the end of the trail. I wasn't going to let the woods beat me. But the truth was, I was scared. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger by the minute. Every step I took, every noise I heard, seemed like it was coming from something just beyond my sight. That's when I heard the sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then the sound grew louder, and it wasn't just one rustling noise. It was footsteps. Someone was following me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned around slowly, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was dark now, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I called out, but my voice felt weak, like the words were swallowed up by the dense air around me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs were starting to give out, but I pushed myself harder, feeling my muscles burn as I dashed through the underbrush, blindly making my way down the trail. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled into a clearing. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The cold air stung my lungs, and my vision was blurry from the adrenaline. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. A cabin. It stood there, old and weathered, just off the trail. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and empty, the door slightly ajar. I felt a surge of relief. Maybe someone lived here, maybe I could find help. I forced myself to my feet and stumbled toward the cabin, my legs shaky beneath me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside, hoping to find a fire or someone to talk to. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. There were no signs of life, no fire, no movement. It was completely still. I moved through the cabin, my hands brushing against dusty furniture and cobwebs. The place was abandoned, long abandoned. I wasn't sure how I knew, but the emptiness inside felt wrong. That's when I saw it. A map pinned to the wall. It was old, frayed around the edges, but it was a map of the forest. And there, marked clearly on it, was the trail I had been following. Except it wasn't a trail anymore. The map showed a path that led to a dead end, a sharp drop-off into nothingness. The trail I had been following had led me straight into a trap. A chill ran down my spine as I backed away from the map. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. I turned around and saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway behind me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. But then the figure stepped forward. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a person, it was a hiker. He was just like me, worn and tired, like someone who had been out here far too long. His face was gaunt, his clothes ragged, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just nodded toward the door, and I knew what he meant. He was showing me the way out. That I didn't hesitate. I ran. I followed him through the woods, back to the main trail. It wasn't easy, but after what felt like an eternity, I saw the familiar trail markers again. I was out of the woods. I made it back to civilization just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I never spoke about what happened that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of running without knowing what I was running from. And I'll never, ever hike that trail again. That cabin, though, it's still there, waiting for the next person to wander too far. I don't think anyone ever leaves, but I did. I got out, and that's all that matters. I had always been an avid hiker, someone who loved the peace and challenge of the outdoors. So, when I decided to take on a new trail deep in the mountains, I thought nothing of it. The route was supposed to be remote, challenging, and a true test of endurance. Perfect adventure, I told myself. The day started like any other hiking trip. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as I parked my car at the trailhead. I grabbed my backpack, filled with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, a compass, and my trusty knife. The air was crisp, the kind that made you feel alive, and the sound of birds chirping filled the silence. The trail was quiet, almost too quiet, but I wasn't bothered. Most people stayed on the easier, more popular paths, and this one was known for being more rugged and less traveled. As I started walking, I took in the beauty around me. The tall pines, the distant peaks, the occasional squirrel darting across the trail. It was peaceful, and it felt like the world was mine. The first few hours were easy enough. The trail was steep in some spots, but nothing I couldn't handle. I was used to longer hikes, but this one was different. The further I went, the less maintained the trail became. The path was narrow, overgrown in places with thorny bushes, and sometimes I had to push branches aside just to keep moving. But the challenge only made it more exciting. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, and I found myself deep in the woods. There were no more sounds of other hikers, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I stopped for a break by a small creek that ran along the trail. The water was clear, the kind of water you could drink straight from the stream. I took a swig and sat back on a rock, enjoying the moment. It wasn't until I got back up to continue that I noticed something odd. The trail seemed different. The trees appeared thicker, the path a little more overgrown. I looked at my map, but there was no indication that I had strayed off course. I figured it was just the terrain playing tricks on me, so I pressed on. As I climbed higher, the feeling of isolation began to settle in. The trail grew steeper, and the air felt thinner. I had expected this, but there was something unsettling about the silence around me. No animals, no birds, just the wind in the trees and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. I kept going, focusing on the path ahead, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. That's when I heard it, a snap like a twig breaking underfoot. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding. I looked around, but there was nothing, just trees. I shook my head and kept walking, trying to brush it off. The trail continued upward, and the climb was getting tougher. My legs were starting to burn, and my water supply was beginning to dwindle. I stopped to take a breath, wiping sweat from my brow, and that's when I noticed it again. A sound, this time louder. Something moving in the brush just off the trail. I was too far from the nearest town to be comfortable with whatever it was. My mind raced. Could be anything, an animal, a person, or even something I didn't want to think about. I picked up my pace, hoping to reach the summit soon, but the trail seemed to go on forever. I checked my watch. It was well past the time I had planned to stop for the night. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more oppressive. As the light began to fade, I realized I had made a serious mistake. The trail wasn't leading me to a summit. It was leading me deeper into the wilderness, further away from any safe spot to camp. My heart started to race as I hurried down the path, hoping to find a clearing or an exit. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees were taller now, and the underbrush was thicker, making it harder to move. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock, and I went down hard, scraping my knee. The pain shot through my leg, but I pushed through it, refusing to stop. The trail ahead was barely visible in the fading light, and the sounds I had heard earlier, the snapping twigs, the rustling, had returned, this time much louder. It felt like something was following me, and no matter how fast I walked, it was always just behind me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I pushed through the thickening trees. The forest seemed to be alive, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I could feel it in my bones, the primal fear that something wasn't right. But I had to keep moving. I had to get out of there. The last light of day was almost gone when I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. I pushed forward, the promise of safety just ahead. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or a sign of another hiker. It was something else entirely. There, in the clearing, was a large boulder, and beneath it, a strange, unnatural pattern had been carved into the earth. The ground was disturbed, the dirt turned over, as if something had been dragged across it. My stomach twisted with unease. I took a few more steps, drawn to the strange markings, when a voice inside me screamed to stop. I turned around quickly, and that's when I saw it, movement in the trees. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, standing just beyond the clearing, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I couldn't move. Then, panic hit me like a wave, and I bolted. I ran through the trees, branches scraping at my arms and face as I pushed myself harder. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop, not with whatever was following me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs burning, and my mind was consumed with fear. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled upon a trail marker. I could barely make it out in the dim light, but it was enough to give me hope. I followed it, every step feeling heavier than the last. As the minutes passed, I heard nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing and the occasional rustle in the trees behind me. Finally, I reached a fork in the trail, and I knew I had to make a choice. One way led back toward the clearing, the other toward the safety of a known trail. I took the path that I hoped would lead me back to civilization. The further I went, the more the oppressive feeling lifted. The sounds from behind me faded, and eventually, the forest seemed to calm. My fear didn't dissipate, but it was easier to breathe, easier to think. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that I finally saw the signs of civilization again. The road, the distant hum of cars, the faint outline of my car in the parking lot where I had started. I collapsed against the hood of my car, my body trembling from the exhaustion and the fear I had felt. I didn't know what had happened out there. I couldn't explain the figure, the strange markings in the dirt, or the overwhelming sense of being hunted. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The trail had seemed like an adventure at first, but now it felt like a warning. I had been too cocky, too confident, and I paid the price. The forest was beautiful, but it wasn't always kind. And some things I realized are better left unexplored. I drove away from that trailhead without a second thought, and I haven't returned to those woods since. Some places are meant to be left alone. I've learned that the hard way. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, a solo hike in the woods, just me and the mountains. I needed a break from everything: the noise, the chaos, the endless responsibilities that had been weighing me down for months. The air was crisp with the early morning chill, and the sky had that soft blue glow that only happens right after sunrise. I had planned the hike for weeks, studying maps and packing carefully, ensuring I had everything I needed: food, water, a first aid kit, a jacket for warmth, and of course my phone, though I hoped I wouldn't need it. I was ready. I left the trailhead just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The trail I chose wasn't too difficult, but it wasn't the easiest either. It was a moderate hike, the kind that would test your stamina without completely draining you. It was perfect, or so I thought. The trail was quiet, too quiet, in fact. Not a single person in sight, No chatter of other hikers or sounds of distant voices. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirping of birds above. It felt peaceful at first, but as the minutes stretched into hours, something shifted. The deeper I went, the more isolated I became. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The shadows seemed to grow longer and heavier, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of being alone. I didn't know exactly what it was at first. Maybe it was just the stillness, or maybe it was the way the air had changed, becoming dense and almost thick, as if something unseen had settled around me. I stopped a few times to drink some water and take a break, but each time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail was narrow, winding through thick woods, and as the landscape started to change, so did the atmosphere. It was like the world was slowly quieting down, almost as if the sounds of nature were retreating, leaving only silence in their wake. I had gone further than I had planned, but that was fine. I had the time, and besides, I was feeling a sense of accomplishment. My legs were sore, my feet were beginning to ache, but the view was worth it. I was nearly at the summit when I noticed the first sign of something strange. A small, barely noticeable path off to the side, hidden beneath the overgrowth. It wasn't on my map, but curiosity got the better of me. I had a moment of hesitation. Something told me not to go down that path, but I shrugged it off. I was an experienced hiker, right? I could handle it. I pushed through the thick underbrush, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under low-hanging trees. The path was steeper than I had anticipated, twisting in ways that felt unnatural. The ground was uneven, and I had to keep my eyes on my footing. My heart started to race for no apparent reason, and I noticed my breath was coming in short bursts. I told myself I was just tired, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had walked this kind of trail before, but never one like this. The path seemed to narrow further the further I went, and the trees became more densely packed, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. I started to feel trapped, like I was in a maze with no exit. I told myself to turn back, but my legs kept moving forward, as if I was being pulled in a direction I couldn't control. The further I went, the more the surroundings began to feel unnatural. The trees looked older here, their trunks gnarled and twisted in strange patterns. The air felt colder too, despite the sun still shining through the canopy above. I paused for a moment, realizing how quiet it had become. The usual sounds of birds and insects had completely stopped. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just eerie silence. It was unsettling, and for the first time, I started to feel like I was making a mistake. I turned around to head back, but when I looked, the path behind me was completely different. It was as if the woods had rearranged themselves. The trees were now blocking the way I had come, and the path I had followed had disappeared. Panic surged through me, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and started walking in the opposite direction, hoping to find another way out. But no matter how far I walked, nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the air colder. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but there was no signal. I checked the time. It was later than I had thought, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. I felt a knot in my stomach, a growing unease that I couldn't shake. Something was watching me. Something was waiting for me. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that the forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was a presence, a living thing that knew I didn't belong. Suddenly, I heard a crack, a loud snap of a branch breaking in the distance. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I wasn't alone. My mind raced, and for a split second I considered running, but where would I go? The trees were too dense, the path too confusing. I had to find a way out, and quickly. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it was hard. My feet were getting heavier, my movements slower. I felt the weight of the forest closing in around me. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement through the trees, something darker than the shadows. It was brief, just a blur, but it was enough. I wasn't imagining it. There was something or someone out there. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, trying to retrace my steps, but everything around me looked the same. The trees, the underbrush, the rocks. It was all starting to blur together. I was lost. I stopped for a moment, trying to clear my mind. I remembered the basic rule of survival. Stay put, don't panic. I sat down on a large rock and tried to take a few deep breaths, telling myself that I just needed to think logically. I had to stay calm. The sun was almost gone, and the forest was beginning to change. The once peaceful woods had become ominous, and I was beginning to realize how vulnerable I was. I should have turned back earlier, but it was too late for regrets now. Night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped. I pulled out my jacket and wrapped it tightly around myself, trying to keep warm. The shadows in the forest seemed to stretch, and the silence was deafening. I could hear the faintest rustling in the distance, but I didn't dare look. I knew something was out there, and I didn't want to know what it was. I had to get out of here. As I sat there, I remembered something that might save me. A ranger station was just a few miles away. I wasn't completely sure of the direction, but if I could find my way back to the main trail, I could make it to the station. I didn't have much time before the darkness would completely engulf the forest. I stood up, my legs shaking, and forced myself to move. I pushed through the thick underbrush, my heart racing with every step. I had no idea if I was going the right way, but I couldn't stop now. The sounds of the forest were growing louder, more intense, more alive. It was as if the woods themselves were trying to keep me there. Then I saw it, a flash of light in the distance, a small beacon. I wasn't imagining it. The ranger station was real, and it was close. I pushed forward, faster now, fueled by the hope that I was going to make it out. The light grew brighter, and within minutes, I stumbled onto the main trail. I could see the glow of a lantern in the distance, and I hurried toward it. When I reached the ranger station, I collapsed, exhausted and trembling. The rangers were there to help, offering me water and food, asking me questions. But I couldn't speak. My mind was still back there in the forest, in the silence, in the shadows. They told me it wasn't uncommon for people to get lost on that trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that wanted me to stay. But I was safe now. I was out of the woods, and I knew I would never hike there again.